The spring mating ceremony was supposed to be the ultimate elevation of a chosen Luna. Instead, it became the moment Elira Vance's entire world shattered. The palace hall of the Silverpine realm was packed shoulder to shoulder with the elite of the pack. A suffocating sea of velvet, silk, and polished armor. Thousands of beeswax candles flickered in the massive wrought iron chandeliers suspended from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm, honeyed glow across the cavernous space. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the underlying nervous musk of hundreds of wolves waiting for their sovereign to speak. Massive tapestries, depicting the violent history of the ancestral alphas, hung along the granite walls, their woven silver threads catching the firelight. The ancient stones beneath Elira's thin slippers radiated a deep, biting chill, a cold that slowly seeped upward into her calves, fighting the heat of the roaring hearths. She stood at the base of the grand obsidian dais, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She wore a simple, unadorned dress of white linen, utterly devoid of the rubies and spun silver that decorated the high-born nobles whispering behind her back. She did not need their finery. For 3 weeks, a secret had kept her warm against the bitter draughts that swept through the palace corridors. On her left wrist, securely hidden beneath the long, plain sleeve of her gown, rested the crescent-claiming mark. It had been a searing, molten gold brand when Alpha King Marcus Valerius first pressed his teeth to her skin in the shadowy, forgotten alcoves of the western wing. The ancient mark throbbed in perfect time with her heartbeat, a constant, comforting rhythm that whispered of her fated bond and secured her absolute devotion. She had believed him when he said he would present her to the ancestors tonight, standing proudly before the entire court to announce their union. She had believed the soft, desperate promises he murmured under the cover of darkness, swearing that her quiet resilience was the only thing keeping his fractured soul together. She was just a Lyra, the silent, observant outcast from the lower boundary villages. She possessed no aggressive shifting abilities, no inherited wealth, and absolutely no political leverage. But she had the sovereign's heart, or so she had allowed herself to believe. She remembered the exact way his hands had trembled when he swore she was his salvation. She had endured the sneers of the palace servants, the cruel glares of the high-born ladies, and the agonizing isolation of keeping their bond a secret. She had done it all willingly, fiercely protecting his political image, knowing that tonight, the ancient moon goddess would validate her worth before them all. Her fingers ghosted over the white linen, covering the mark, tracing the invisible crescent. She was ready to step out of the shadows. She was ready to finally stand beside her true king. The massive oak doors at the far end of the cavernous hall groaned open, the heavy iron hinges echoing like a thunderclap, violently interrupting her fragile hopes. The murmuring crowd fell into an immediate, absolute hush. The pack parted like a physical wave, bowing their heads in deep submission. Marcus entered the hall. He was a terrifyingly imposing figure, broad-shouldered and tall, cloaked in the heavy, sweeping midnight blue furs of his royal office. His eyes, usually a warm, molten amber when they looked upon her in private, were now flat, calculating, and entirely unreadable. He did not look toward the altar where the young woman waited with bated breath. He did not seek out her small, trembling form in the vast crowd, because he was not walking alone. Gliding beside the Alpha King, her pale, manicured hand resting intimately on his muscular forearm, was Lysandra Devay. The high-born rival was a vision of ruthless, calculated perfection, draped in heavy crimson silk that flowed like fresh blood over the polished granite floor. The sweet, overwhelming scent of gardenia rolled off her in suffocating waves, masking a faint underlying metallic tang that reminded Elira of rotting flowers. Lysandra's sharp chin was tilted upward. Her dark lips curved in a subtle, triumphant smirk as she surveyed the lesser wolves of the court. She possessed an impeccable, pure pack lineage. She commanded a brutal army of 3,000 trained warriors from the Northern Territories. She wielded ancestral wealth that could sustain the Silver Pine lands through a century of famine. She possessed every single asset of power that the outcast in the white dress did not. Elira felt the first icy prickle of sheer panic crawl up her spine, locking her joints. The crescent brand on her forearm gave a sharp, agonizing twinge, as if the ancient magic within the brand recognized the incoming devastation before her conscious mind could even process it. Marcus led Lysandra up the wide stone steps of the dais, turning slowly to face the silent, expectant assembly. He raised his heavy ringed hand, and the entire room held its collective breath. "People of the Silver Pine Kingdom," the king began, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. It was the voice of a detached, clinical ruler, stripped entirely of the warmth she knew. "We stand on the precipice of a long, brutal winter. The northern borders are failing beneath the weight of rogue incursions. A true king must make choices not for the selfish desires of his own heart, but for the ultimate survival of his people. He requires undeniable strength. He requires a permanent alliance forged in iron and blood." Elira's lungs simply stopped working. The thick air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin, freezing her throat. She stared up at the man she loved, her grey eyes silently begging him to look down, to meet her gaze, to remember the sacred vows they had whispered in the quiet dark. But Marcus kept his gaze fixed stubbornly on the back of the hall. He was actively, deliberately avoiding her face. The fated seal on her wrist began to burn, but it was no longer a comforting heat. It was the sharp, panicked sting of a dying ember grasping for air. She pleaded silently, her nails digging into her own palms, begging him to look at her and tell her this was a lie. He refused to meet her gaze. "Before the ancestors, the elders, and the moon goddess," the sovereign announced, the cruel words ringing out like a relentless death knell, "I officially reject Elira Vance as my true fated mate, and I deny her the title of Luna of this pack." The silence that followed his declaration was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating physical weight that pressed down on the young woman's chest, threatening to crack her ribs and crush her heart into dust. "In her place," Marcus continued, finally turning to take Lysandra's eager hands into his own, "I claim Duchess Lysandra de Val as my chosen mate and queen. Our union will instantly secure the Northern Territories and ensure the eternal prosperity of our bloodline." The betrayal was not merely a calculated political maneuver. It was an act of extreme physical violence against Elira's body. The precise moment the formal, ancient words of rejection left the Alpha's lips, the crescent symbol on her flesh flared with a blinding, excruciating heat. She gasped, her knees buckling slightly as she grabbed her forearm. The molten gold energy within the spiritual brand violently inverted. The comforting, living warmth was instantly replaced by a biting, frost-cold ache that sank straight through her skin and deep into her marrow. The magic of their bond was dying, screaming as it was severed by the very authority that had created it. She could feel the spiritual tearing as a literal, physical rupture behind her ribs, a violent ripping of her soul that left her gasping for a single breath of air. Her vision swam with jagged edges of black and silver. The pain was absolute, carving a hollow, agonizing chasm straight through her chest. It felt as if a jagged blade of ice was slowly being twisted into her ribcage, ruthlessly severing the ethereal golden thread that had tied her spirit to his. She bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted the sharp tang of copper blood, violently forcing herself to remain standing. She would not let them see her break. She would not give them her tears. With trembling, numb fingers, she peeled back the white linen sleeve of her gown. The once glowing, beautiful crescent had turned a dead, ashen grey. The delicate skin around it was raised and violently angry, but the mark itself was completely devoid of life. It felt exactly like a solid block of ice, chained permanently to her pulse. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. The horrifying realization settled over her trembling shoulders like a heavy burial shroud. She was truly, permanently cast out. Cruel whispers broke out across the grand hall, buzzing like a swarm of angry hornets. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her, filled with a sickening, toxic mixture of pity, mockery, and outright relief. She was the pathetic, low-status Omega who had dared to reach too high above her station. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. The agonizing truth finally slammed into her. The king had kept her hidden in the shadows, not to protect her from the court, but because he was fundamentally ashamed of her existence. He had selfishly used her quiet, unshakable devotion as a temporary, soothing comfort until a proper, politically useful bride could be secured. Lysandra looked down from the high dais, her cloying gardenia scent thickening with malicious triumph. "The Alpha King has spoken his will," the new bride said, her voice dripping with artificial saccharine sympathy. "You are officially dismissed from this court. It is highly advised that you pack your meager belongings and leave the capital before the sun rises. Your continued presence here is an ugly insult to the true crown." Elira did not cry. She did not scream. She did not fall to the floor and beg the monarch to reconsider his cruel choice. The agonizing, fiery humiliation burned like acid in her throat, but she forced her spine entirely straight. She refused to give the smirking rival or the cowardly king the satisfaction of witnessing her total collapse. She stood completely still, a tiny, solitary figure surrounded by the hostile, elite wolves of the capital. She was a silent, resilient outcast, wrapped tightly in the freezing, somatic torment of a severed soul bond, utterly and completely alone in a room of thousands. She guarded. Then the oppressive, mocking silence of the vast room was violently shattered by the sharp, heavy sound of a massive armored boot stepping forward. From the rigid line of the Alpha's personal vanguard, a solitary, imposing figure deliberately broke rank. Cailan Sterling, the crisp, sharp scent of winter pine and worn leather, cut violently through the suffocating gardenia fragrance, rolling across the cavernous room like a physical warning. He was the king's primary commander, his closest, oldest confidant, and a man whose terrifying reputation was built entirely on ruthless battlefield efficiency and absolute, unquestioning loyalty. He was a veritable mountain of a man, clad entirely in the dark, interlocking obsidian armor of the Royal Guard. His impossibly broad shoulders blocked the ambient light from the nearest chandelier, casting a long, heavy, and deeply protective shadow across the cold granite floor. Where Marcus possessed the polished, golden charisma of a smiling politician, the commander possessed the grim, unyielding, and terrifying stillness of a dormant winter storm. Every soldier in the vanguard held their breath. Cailan was not just a warrior. He was the lethal enforcer of the Silverpine Pack. His word on the battlefield was absolute law. Yet here he was, deliberately stepping out of his assigned place, his dark eyes locked entirely on the shivering pale girl in the center of the floor. Cailan walked slowly, his heavy boots ringing out in the cavernous space, until he stopped directly in the center of the hall, positioning his massive frame firmly between the broken girl and the towering dais. He did not kneel. He did not bow his head in reverence. He simply looked up at the newly crowned sovereign with eyes the color of dark, freezing steel, his square jaw tight with a barely restrained, lethal fury. "You speak of honor, Marcus." The warrior's voice was a low, resonant rumble that physically vibrated through the ancient stone floorboards. He was the only male in the entire kingdom who dared address the ruler by his given name without attaching a royal title. "You speak of survival and the future of the pack, but there is absolutely no survival for a kingdom that willingly spits on the sacred laws of the moon goddess." The Alpha's amber eyes flared with a dangerous golden warning, his lips pulling back to bare his canines. "Hold your tongue, Commander. This is a complex matter of state politics, not a battlefield for the vanguard. The decision has been made, and it is final." You have cowardly discarded your true fated mate for a handful of northern swords and a heavy chest of silver, Kaelin continued, entirely ignoring the aggressive command. His tone was not loud, it was not frantic, but it carried an absolute, uncompromising authority that demanded total silence from the room. You willingly sever a sacred divine bond just to share a bed with blind ambition. That is not the honorable act of a king. That is the desperate act of a coward. Shocked gasps rippled violently through the gathered nobility. Several loyal guards instinctively reached for the hilts of their weapons, the sharp, metallic ring of drawing steel echoing ominously in the enclosed space, but absolutely none of them dared to approach the vanguard leader. He was the man who had personally trained every single soldier in the room. He knew exactly how to break every bone in their bodies before they could even swing a blade. Lysandra's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a furious, ugly sneer. Treason! He speaks open treason against the crown. Arrest him immediately. Marcus stepped forward to the very edge of the stone dais, his large hands gripping the carved railing so tightly that his knuckles turned a bloodless white. You forget your place in my court, Kaelin. I am your reigning alpha. You swore a blood oath to serve my command without question. I swore a blood oath to serve the true honorable alpha of Silverpine, the commander replied flatly, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register that sent shivers down the spines of the onlookers. The man who took that oath died the exact moment he allowed politics to poison his soul. I will not serve a corrupted ruler who destroys the innocent, simply to mask his own glaring weakness. The stark realization of betrayal in the king's expression twisted rapidly into absolute, unhinged rage. The public, undeniable defiance from his absolute best friend, the very man who had fought back-to-back with him in a dozen bloody border skirmishes and kept him alive, was a severe humiliation he could not possibly endure. The sovereign's fangs fully descended, a low, guttural snarl ripping violently from his deep chest. Then you are permanently stripped of your rank, Marcus roared, the booming sound deafening in the enclosed, echoing space. You are no longer the commander of the vanguard. You are officially stripped of your ancestral lands, your royal titles, and your designated place within this pack. You are exiled, Kaelin Sterling. Leave the capital boundaries tonight, or you will be publicly executed at dawn. Kaelin did not flinch. He did not attempt to argue or beg for clemency. The stoic, battle-hardened warrior simply reached up to his broad shoulders and unclasped the heavy, silver-threaded cloak that signified his supreme military command. He let the heavy garment slip from his dark armor. It hit the granite floor with a dull, incredibly final thud, gathering dust at the base of the royal dais. "Keep your worthless titles," the exiled commander murmured, his deep voice laced with a profound, heavy disgust. "They are already stained with her innocent blood anyway." He deliberately turned his broad back on the Alpha King, an act of supreme, unthinkable disrespect that sent a literal shockwave of horror through the gathered wolves. Kaelin completely ignored the seething ruler and closed the short distance between himself and Illyra. The large, heavily armed, and intimidating warrior stopped just inches away from her trembling, isolated form. He looked down at her, and the violent winter storm raging in his dark eyes instantly softened into something unbearably, heartbreakingly gentle. The scent of winter pine and worn leather washed over her, overpowering the nauseating smell of gardenia and fear that coated the room. It was a fiercely protective scent, grounding her shattered senses. Up close, she could see the faint, jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, a testament to the countless times he had bled for a king who did not deserve his absolute loyalty. Stared up at him, her vision suddenly blurring with the hot, unshed tears she had refused to give to Marcus. She had always known Kaelin as the silent, unmovable shadow, the quiet man who stood dutifully in the background while the king eagerly claimed all the light and glory. She had never spoken more than a sparse handful of polite words to the imposing commander during her secret, hidden visits to the royal palace. Yet here he was, willingly throwing away his entire successful life, his impeccable honor, and his ancestral home, all to fiercely protest her unjust humiliation. The warrior did not offer her any empty, meaningless apologies for his former friend's cruelty. He did not treat her like a fragile, broken Omega who needed to be pitied by the court. Instead, he slowly, deliberately lowered his massive frame down to one knee, the heavy metal joints of his dark armor grinding loudly in the otherwise completely silent room. He reached out toward her with a massive, heavily calloused hand, his long fingers as steady and reliable as a mountain rock. Elira looked down at his scarred, battle-worn palm. The dead, ashen grey bite mark on her own wrist throbbed with a residual, freezing ache, a constant, sickening reminder of the ambitious man who had just thrown her away like garbage. But as she looked at the commander, kneeling before her in the dirt, the adrenaline that had miraculously kept her spine straight finally evaporated. Her exhausted knees buckled under the agonizing, physical weight of the spiritual severing, sending her collapsing toward the freezing stone floor. She never hit the granite. Kaelin moved with blinding, lethal speed, his massive arms catching her fragile form and pulling her securely against his obsidian armor. She lay there against his broad chest, utterly broken and abandoned by her pack, gasping for air as her shattered soul wept in absolute silence. The exact moment their skin physically touched, a subtle, completely unexpected sensation rolled violently through her veins. It was not the burning, chaotic, molten heat of the Alpha's deceptive mark, but a deep, profoundly grounding warmth, exactly like the steady, enduring embers of a hearth fire, holding back the bitter winter cold. The relentless, freezing ache in her wrist did not vanish, but it was immediately insulated by this new, quiet strength. Kaelin's strong fingers closed gently but securely around her waist, instantly wrapping her within his absolute uncompromising protection. He stood up in one fluid motion, effortlessly lifting her back to her feet, though he kept one steady arm wrapped firmly around her trembling shoulders, transforming himself into a living shield against the staring court. Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me, Kaelin murmured softly, his words meant entirely and exclusively for her ears, his low voice acting as an impenetrable fortress against the cruel whispers of the elite, as he gently guided her toward the massive exit. They walked down the long, central aisle of the cavernous hall together, their footsteps echoing in perfect unison against the ancient stone. The heavy, suffocating air of the palace suddenly felt irrelevant, pushed back by the sheer commanding force of the commander's aura. The massive crowd parted frantically before Kaelin's dark, unyielding, and dangerous presence. They scrambled backward, knocking over golden goblets and dropping their velvet trains in their haste to avoid his steely gaze. No royal soldier moved a single muscle to block their path. No high-born noble dared to speak a word of insult or mockery. Elira kept her chin held high, drawing an immense sudden strength from the unshakable, warm grip of the exiled warrior at her side. She did not look back. Behind them, the foolish Alpha King sat rigidly on his stolen throne beside his wealthy, toxic bride, clutching his new political power like a hollow shield. But as the heavy wooden doors of the palace slammed shut with a booming finality, sealing Elira and Kaelin out into the freezing, liberating night, Marcus Valerius realized with a sudden pang of hollow dread that he had just permanently lost the only two people who had ever truly loved him. The transition from the suffocating, incense-choked air of the Silverpine capital to the biting, merciless chill of the open winter night was instantaneous and violently jarring. Elira Vance stumbled as her thin linen slippers sank into the deep, fresh snowdrifts that blanketed the outer courtyard. The adrenaline that had armored her spine in the great hall was rapidly bleeding away, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing physical void. The crescent seal on her left wrist, once a source of molten, golden comfort, had completely solidified into a jagged block of spiritual ice. Every frantic beat of her exhausted heart pushed a freezing, unnatural ache through her veins, a constant, sickening reminder of the fated bond that Marcus Valerius had so ruthlessly butchered on the obsidian altar. She shivered violently, her small frame curling inward as the freezing wind whipped her dark hair across her pale face. Cailan Sterling did not hesitate. The massive, dark-armored warrior shrugged off the sheer, freezing temperature, as if it were nothing more than a mild spring breeze. He reached down with a heavily calloused hand and gently pulled his own thick, fur-lined travel cloak from the saddle of his waiting warhorse. Without a single word of unnecessary instruction or pity, he draped the massive, coarse garment over Elira's trembling shoulders. The scent of winter pine, worn leather, and the faint, metallic tang of cold steel instantly enveloped her. The cloak was ridiculously large on her small frame, the hem dragging across the snow, but the residual body heat trapped within the thick animal pelt was an immediate, overwhelming salvation. It did not erase the frost-cold agony of the dead mark on her wrist, but it insulated her shivering core against the unforgiving elements. "The capital patrols will begin sweeping the outer boundaries before dawn," Cailan murmured, his deep, resonant voice cutting clearly through the howling wind. He kept his gaze fixed securely on the dark, looming tree line of the Shadowwood forest ahead, his situational awareness absolute. "We need to put as much distance between us and the palace as possible. Can you ride, or do you need me to carry you?" He offered her a choice. It was such an incredibly simple, mundane question, yet it struck Elira with the force of a physical blow. For months, the Alpha King had dictated her every single movement, hiding her in shadowy alcoves, instructing her on how to stand, how to speak, and how to remain entirely invisible, so as not to disrupt his precious political image. Marcus had treated her entirely like a fragile, shameful secret, an asset to be managed and ultimately discarded. Cailan, the most lethal, terrifying enforcer in the entire kingdom, was looking at her as if she were a fully capable, sovereign individual. "I can ride," she whispered, her voice rough and raspy from the unshed tears burning in the back of her throat. She did not want to be a burden. She did not want to show any more weakness than she already had. The commander simply nodded once. His massive hands gripped her waist with a stunning, breathtaking gentleness, and he effortlessly lifted her into the heavy leather saddle of his midnight black warhorse. He swung up behind her a moment later, his broad chest forming a solid, impenetrable wall of dark armor and warm muscle at her back. He did not crowd her. He kept a distinct, respectful millimeter of space between their bodies, ensuring she did not feel trapped or caged, yet his heavy arms rested securely on either side of her to grip the thick leather reins. "Hold on," he instructed softly. The warhorse surged forward, plunging them directly into the dark, mist-shrouded depths of the Shadowwood forest. The oppressive darkness would have terrified any normal Omega, but to Elira, the shadows felt like a profoundly safe, welcoming embrace. They were finally hidden from the cruel, mocking eyes of the high-born elite. They were hidden from the toxic, suffocating scent of gardenia and betrayal that clung to Lysandra Deval. But the journey did not end with the sunrise. For 2 grueling, agonizing weeks, they traveled through the treacherous, snow-bound wilderness. They moved primarily under the cover of night, systematically evading the vicious capital patrols that Marcus had sent sweeping across the northern boundaries. Cailan's situational awareness was absolute, flawlessly guiding them through freezing blizzards, treacherous ravines, and narrow mountain passes where the snow piled chest-high. The biting winter frost gnawed mercilessly at the exposed skin of the outcast's cheeks, but the sheer physical exhaustion was a welcome distraction from the agonizing, spiritual hemorrhage occurring inside her chest. The severed mate bond was a living, breathing wound. It felt exactly like a jagged fault line cracking through her ribs, threatening to violently split her entirely in two. Every time her mind drifted back to the image of her former mate turning his back on her, slipping his hands into his new bride's, the ashen-grey crescent scar on her arm throbbed with a sickening venomous sting. She bit down hard on her lower lip, tasting the sharp copper tang of her own blood, desperately forcing herself to remain conscious through the freezing nights. She could not collapse here. She would not let this horrific betrayal destroy her. When the cold became unbearable, Kalen would wrap his arms tighter around her, silently offering his massive body as a shield against the freezing wind, his steadfast presence pulling her back from the brink of despair. It was during the second week of their harrowing exile that the heavy, rhythmic hoofbeats of the warhorse finally slowed to a steady walk. The first faint, bruised purple hues of false dawn were bleeding into the eastern horizon as the dense tree line suddenly parted, revealing a hidden, rugged clearing nestled deep within the protective heart of the ancient forest. A small, sturdy log cabin stood in the center, its thick timber walls heavily insulated with dried moss and packed earth. A stone chimney stubbornly pushed a thin, welcoming trail of grey smoke up into the freezing winter sky. It was the Shadowwood outpost, Kaelin's private, secluded sanctuary, completely disconnected from the toxic political machinations of the Silver Pine capital. Kaelin brought the massive horse to a halt near a timber hitching post. He dismounted with a heavy, metallic clatter of his dark obsidian armor, then turned to reach up for his passenger. Elira tried to move, to gracefully slide down from the saddle, but her body completely refused to obey her commands. The sheer, catastrophic toll of the severed soul bond, combined with 14 days of freezing temperatures and massive adrenaline depletion, finally caught up to her. Her numb fingers simply slipped from the leather pommel, her vision violently tilted, the dark pines spinning into a blurred, chaotic smear of grey and black. She fell, but just like in the Great Hall, she never felt the hard, unforgiving impact of the frozen ground. The warrior's strong arms caught her mid-air, gathering her entirely against his broad chest, as easily as if she weighed absolutely nothing. The residual, steady warmth radiating from his body was a stark, desperate contrast to the freezing hollow void consuming her chest. She gasped, her small hands instinctively clutching at the rigid edges of his dark breastplate, anchoring herself to the only solid, reliable thing left in her shattered world. "I have got you," the exiled commander murmured, his deep voice rumbling against her ear, laced with a fierce, uncompromising protectiveness. "You are safe here, Elira. I promise you, no one is ever going to hurt you again." He carried her swiftly through the heavy timber door of the outpost, kicking it shut behind them with a solid, definitive thud that sealed out the howling winter wind. The interior of the cabin was remarkably warm, smelling faintly of dried sage, old parchment, and the lingering, comforting scent of burning cedar. It was a rustic, strictly utilitarian space, devoid of the opulent velvet tapestries, silver candelabras, or massive obsidian thrones that defined the royal palace. To the broken girl, it was the most beautiful, perfect sanctuary she had ever seen. Kaelin moved deliberately, crossing the small room to lay her gently upon a thick, heavy mattress covered in pristine white wolf pelts near the roaring hearth. The firelight cast dancing, golden shadows across the rough-hewn timber walls, pushing back the oppressive darkness. He immediately knelt beside the bed, his dark eyes intensely focused on her pale, shivering form. He did not hover or crowd her space. Instead, he systematically began tending to her physical needs with the exact same clinical, unwavering dedication he would use to repair a shattered shield on the battlefield. He carefully unwrapped the massive, fur-lined travel cloak from her shoulders, making sure not to jostle her aching body. His large, heavily calloused fingers were incredibly gentle as he reached down to inspect her ruined, snow-soaked linen slippers. The thin fabric was completely torn, her delicate feet bruised blue from the brutal cold of their long journey. A dark, dangerous shadow crossed Kaelin's stoic features, his jaw clenching so tightly she could hear the faint grind of his teeth. The elite of the capital had forced her to stand on a freezing granite floor in nothing but decorative, useless garments, completely ignoring her basic, fundamental need for warmth. He removed the wet slippers and tossed them into the hearth fire, watching with a grim, hard satisfaction as the useless, high-born fabric curled into black ash. He retrieved a thick woolen blanket from a nearby cedar chest and draped it securely over her legs, tucking the edges in to trap the heat. "Drink this," Kaelin instructed softly, returning a moment later with a steaming clay mug. The fragrant, earthy aroma of crushed willow bark and dried hand chamomile drifted up from the dark liquid. "It will help dull the physical pain of the severing. It will not cure the ache in your chest, but it will let you sleep." Elira pushed herself up onto her elbows, her arms trembling violently with the effort. She reached for the mug, but her hands were shaking too badly to secure a solid grip. The dead, ashen brand on her left wrist flared with a sharp, sickening pulse of icy agony, violently protesting any movement. She flinched, a quiet, involuntary whimper escaping her chapped lips as she pressed her arm tightly against her stomach. Kaelin immediately pulled the mug back. He did not offer any useless apologies or empty words of pity. He simply sat down on the very edge of the mattress, his massive frame anchoring the bed, and carefully brought the warm rim to her lips himself. He supported the back of her head with one large, steady hand, his touch impossibly light, allowing her to drink at her own slow, measured pace. The herbal tea was bitter, but it carried a deep, soothing warmth that slowly began to thaw the freezing knot of panic in her stomach. As she swallowed the last drop, she looked up into Kaelin's dark, storm-grey eyes. They were not filled with the calculating, ambitious amber fire of the Alpha King. They were steady, deep, and profoundly patient. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the absolute worst horrors the world had to offer, and who had deliberately chosen to remain honorable in spite of them. "Why did you do it?" Elira whispered, the raw, vulnerable question slipping out before she could stop it. "You threw away your entire life, your rank, your ancestral lands. You gave up everything you have ever worked for, just to pull me off that floor. Why?" The commander carefully set the empty mug on a nearby side table. He did not look away from her. He did not attempt to mask his true feelings behind a veil of political indifference. He looked at her with an absolute, searing honesty that made her breath catch in her throat. "Because the rank and the lands meant absolutely nothing to me if I had to watch a corrupt coward destroy the only genuinely good thing in that entire cursed palace," Kaelin replied flatly, his voice dropping into a low, resonant timbre that physically vibrated in the small room. He reached out, his rough, scarred fingers lightly brushing a stray lock of dark hair away from her pale, exhausted face. "You are not an asset. You are not a pawn to be traded for northern alliances. You are fiercely loyal, you are unbroken, and you deserved a king who would have burned the entire world down just to keep you safe." He pulled his hand back, strictly maintaining the physical boundary between them, his respect for her fragile state absolute. "Rest now. The capital will not find us here. I will stand watch until the snow melts." Elira closed her heavy eyes, pulling the thick woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders. She did not cry for Marcus. The freezing, hollow void on her wrist still ached with a phantom, venomous sting. But as she listened to the steady, rhythmic sound of Kaelin stoking the hearth fire, a tiny, unfamiliar spark of genuine safety flickered to life in the deepest, darkest corner of her shattered heart. She was a cast-out Omega, stripped of her pack and her pride. But as she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, she realized that she was no longer alone. Weeks turned into their second and third months, and the brutal, unforgiving winter slowly surrendered to the gentle, persistent thaw of early spring. The Shadowwood outpost remained their absolute, unbothered sanctuary. The frantic, Desperate panic that had initially gripped Elira's chest had gradually faded, replaced by a quiet, steady, and remarkably peaceful domestic routine. She had found a profound, unexpected healing in the quiet, mundane rhythms of her exile. Her days were spent entirely on her own terms. She learned to mend Kaelin's thick woolen cloaks, her fingers carefully navigating the heavy, coarse fabrics. She learned to forage for wild roots and medicinal herbs along the damp, mossy banks of the nearby forest streams. She found a deep, somatic satisfaction in the physical labor, in the way the rich, dark soil felt beneath her fingernails, and the way the crisp, clean pine air filled her lungs, and through it all, Kaelin Sterling remained her unshakable, silent anchor. He hunted in the deep forest, bringing back fresh venison to keep their small larder full. He chopped mountains of fire logs, the rhythmic, heavy thud of his iron axe echoing through the trees, a constant, reassuring heartbeat that promised absolute security. The exiled commander never once pushed her boundaries. He never once demanded her gratitude. He treated her with a level of profound, quiet reverence that, slowly, meticulously stitched the shattered fragments of her self-worth back together. It was during the 3rd month of their exile that the fragile peace of the forest was suddenly shattered. The unnatural shift in the atmosphere happened just before dusk. A freezing, suffocating wave of dark energy suddenly pulsed through the damp soil, instantly withering the spring wildflowers around the cabin. Kaelin drew his broadsword instantly, his storm-grey eyes scanning the dense tree line. He commanded Elira to stay inside the safety of the outpost, but the fierce, unbroken loyalty in her chest refused to let him face the unknown danger alone. She followed him into the darkening forest, her bare feet silent on the moss. They found the source of the corruption in a rugged, hidden clearing deeply buried beneath the ancient pines. Half submerged in the freezing mud lay the Veil Walker relic, an ancient obsidian stone artifact radiating a violent, toxic black mist. The dark magic was volatile, screaming with the suppressed agony of centuries of buried lore. Kaelin stepped forward, raising his heavy steel blade to shatter the cursed stone. But the moment his shadow crossed the artifact, the Veil Walker relic reacted violently to his presence. The dark magic lashed out like venomous, freezing whips, wrapping tightly around the massive warrior's chest and arms. Kaelin dropped his sword with a heavy clang, collapsing to his knees as the shadows violently crushed the breath from his lungs. The brutal, frost-cold magic began to freeze his heart, draining the life from the lethal commander in seconds. "Kaelin!" Elira screamed, the sound tearing raw and desperate from her throat. She did not hesitate. She did not cower in the shadows like the weak, defective Omega the capital had claimed her to be. Driven by a sudden, overwhelming surge of fierce, protective instinct, Elira sprinted across the clearing. She did not reach for his hands to pull him free. She threw herself directly at the source of the lethal curse. Her small, dirt-smudged hands slammed directly onto the freezing, jagged surface of the obsidian Veil Walker relic. She meant to absorb the deadly magic, willing to sacrifice her own life, to save the only man who had ever made her feel entirely safe. But the exact moment her bare skin made contact with the ancient stone, a violent, breathtaking shockwave of pure, unadulterated energy ripped through the quiet forest clearing. It was not the cold sting of death. It was an explosion of supreme, cosmic resonance. A deep, profound vibration physically shook the damp earth beneath her knees. Elira gasped, her eyes going wide with absolute shock as a sudden, blinding sensation of pure, liquid warmth rushed violently through her veins. The warmth entirely bypassed the dead, ashen-claiming mark on her wrist, shooting straight into the very core of her soul. The dark, suffocating magic of the relic instantly shattered, purifying into a brilliant, glowing cascade of golden and silver light. Kaelin fell back, gasping for air as the freezing shadows dissolved into nothingness. He looked up at her, his dark eyes wide with absolute unshielded awe. "Elira," the exiled commander breathed, his deep voice trembling, "look at your skin. She looked down, her breath catching in a sharp, terrified gasp. Beneath the fading light of dusk, her pale skin was physically changing. A faint, ethereal, and undeniably beautiful silver light was radiating from directly beneath her flesh. It started at the exact point where her fingers touched the purified relic, spreading rapidly up her forearm in intricate, swirling geometric patterns that looked exactly like ancient, woven stardust. The dormant, suppressed magic was waking up, singing a high, piercing note of absolute truth that vibrated in her very marrow. The ashen, grey crescent brand on her wrist, the agonizing symbol of Marcus Valerius's cruel rejection, suddenly hissed as the brilliant, glowing silver stardust patterns swept over the dead scar tissue. The old claiming mark violently shattered. It literally dissolved into a wisp of dark smoke, entirely erased and overwritten by the supreme, undeniable power flowing through her own blood. The blinding surge of cosmic energy did not fade with the dusk. As the days bled into their 4th month of exile, the radiant resonance of the shattered artifact seeped deep into the very roots of the Shadowwood. The newly awakened magic transformed the surrounding forest, painting the leaves with a subtle, silvery luminescence. Whispers of the purified magic traveled on the wind, reaching far beyond the isolated borders of their sanctuary, and the old world finally came looking for its rightful sovereign. It was a crisp, clear morning in the middle of month 4, when the fragile peace of the outpost was breached once more. Kalen stepped instinctively in front of Alira, his hand resting securely on the hilt of his broadsword as a lone figure emerged from the dense ancient pines. The ancient prophecies, a frail, trembling voice echoed from the edge of the clearing. They spoke the truth. Standing near the tree line, leaning heavily on a carved ash staff, was Priest Thomas Oakhaven. The ancient, wise keeper of the old law had tracked the profound magical pulse all the way from the Silverpine capital. Now he fell to his knees in the damp soil, tears of profound reverence streaming down his weathered, wrinkled face as he looked upon Elira's glowing, starlit aura. "The dormant bloodline has awakened," Thomas murmured, bowing his head until his forehead touched the moss. "You are not a broken Omega child. You possess the divine lineage. You are the sovereign of the Vale Walkers, the true, original heir to the moon goddess herself." The magic had remained entirely dormant, deeply suppressed by the toxic, controlling nature of her previous fated bond. It had required genuine, unconditional safety. It had required the fierce, sacrificial choice to protect a true guardian to finally unlock its supreme potential. Thomas slowly raised his head, his ancient eyes shifting from the glowing queen to the stoic, massive warrior standing protectively at her side. "And you, Kalen Sterling, who sacrificed your rank and your lands to shield the true vessel. The moon goddess recognizes your absolute devotion. By the old laws of our ancestors, I officially name you her chosen consort, the true guardian of the lunar crown." He did not pull back in fear. He did not peer at her with the calculating, greedy hunger that Marcus Valerius would have shown upon discovering such supreme, unyielding power. Instead, the exiled commander slowly shifted his massive frame, bowing in a gesture of absolute, unshakable reverence beside the kneeling priest. He pressed his lips gently against the glowing, silver-traced knuckles of her small hand, entirely submitting his lethal strength to her newly awakened sovereignty. Elira Vance squeezed his hand, the cosmic, ancient power humming vibrantly in her chest. "Thank you for letting me go," she thought, the memory of the capital fading like ash, because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better sanctuary, and a far greater destiny, and she would never, ever look back. The ancient priest, Thomas Oakhaven, lingered only to witness the stabilization of the cosmic energy radiating from the young queen. With a deeply reverent bow, pressing his weathered forehead against the freezing earth, he gathered his ash staff. The keeper of the old law backed away slowly, his ancient eyes wide with awe and the terrifying realization of the inevitable war to come. He vanished into the mist-shrouded depths of the Shadowwood, leaving behind a silent promise to carry the truth of the awakened Veilwalker sovereign to the loyalists scattered across the fractured territories. When the rhythmic, crunching sound of the priest's footsteps finally faded into the whispering pines, a profound and heavy silence settled over the hidden clearing. Elira Vance stood completely still, her small bare feet anchored securely in the damp, freezing soil. She did not feel the biting, bitter chill of the winter night anymore. A deep, profound vibration physically shook the earth beneath her toes, resonating in perfect, flawless harmony with the steady, rhythmic pulse of her own heart. She looked down at her trembling hands, her breath catching sharply in her throat as she studied the intricate, glowing geometric patterns of silver stardust swirling directly beneath her pale skin. For her entire adult life, the young woman had been systematically conditioned to believe she was nothing. She was the defective Omega, the silent servant confined to the lower boundary villages. She had spent grueling years mastering the agonizing art of making herself small, of suffocating her own voice just to survive the hierarchy of the Silverpine court. But the magic currently humming through her veins refused to be small. It was ancient and infinite. It felt like a brilliant, roaring river of liquid moonlight, washing away every lingering trace of the toxic shame she had carried for decades. The exact spot on her left wrist where the Alpha King's false, agonizing crescent bite had once chained. Her soul was now completely smooth. The dead, ashen scar tissue had vanished entirely, overwritten by an undeniable, sovereign purity. She was finally whole. Cailan Sterling remained exactly where he was, his massive, dark-armored frame providing a grounding contrast to the ethereal silver light bathing the clearing. He did not rush forward to crowd her physical space. He did not look at her with the greedy ambition that had always burned in Marcus Valerius's amber eyes. Instead, the exiled commander simply watched her breathe. His storm-grey eyes were soft, filled with a steadfast devotion that anchored the overwhelmed senses of the new queen back to the physical reality of the earth. "The frost is setting in rapidly," Cailan murmured, his deep, resonant voice effortlessly breaking the quiet, enchanted spell of the ancient woods. He slowly and deliberately sheathed his heavy broadsword, the metallic sliding of steel offering a familiar, intensely comforting rhythm. "You have just expelled a massive amount of ancestral energy. You need to rest, Elira. Let me take you inside where it is warm." She nodded silently, gratefully allowing the massive warrior to gently guide her back into the rustic, protective warmth of the Shadowwood outpost. The heavy timber door shut with a solid, definitive thud, immediately sealing out the howling winds and the vast, terrifying political implications of her newly discovered lineage. The interior of the small cabin was a sanctuary of profound, unquestionable domestic safety. The deeply familiar sense of dried sage, old parchment, and burning cedar wrapped around her frayed, exhausted nerves like a heavy, protective blanket. Elira sat on the edge of the mattress, pulling a thick woolen blanket up to her chin as she watched him. He moved deliberately about the small room, his actions heavily focused on her comfort. He stoked the dying embers in the stone hearth until a roaring golden fire pushed back the shadows. When he finished, he paused at the threshold of the adjoining larder, preparing a soothing cup of willow bark tea. Elira didn't know that the man standing in the doorway had buried 3 women who dared to love him. Long before her arrival, the elite ladies of the capital had sought his favor, drawn to his lethal reputation. But they had all misunderstood his true nature, fleeing in terror when they realized he was not a tame, manageable political asset. He was a true, feral wolf of the deep woods who demanded transparent truth and unapologetic loyalty. He had isolated himself entirely, building thick walls of glacial ice around his heart to survive the toxic court. But for the silent outcast sitting on his bed, those walls had never existed. Cailan turned, holding the steaming clay mug in his heavily calloused, battle-scarred hands. He crossed the small room and offered it to her. As she reached out, his knuckles brushed lightly against her glowing, silver-traced fingers. A sharp, incredibly pleasant spark of genuine, chosen warmth flared instantly between their skin. It was not the burning, chaotic, and suffocating brand of a forced alpha bond. It was a deep, steady, and profoundly safe somatic resonance, exactly like a hearth fire that promised to burn continuously through the longest, darkest winter. "Thomas just named you my consort," Elira whispered, her fragile voice breaking the comfortable silence as she stared down at the swirling steam rising from the dark liquid. Her heart suddenly began hammering a frantic, nervous rhythm against her ribs. "The priest bound your fate to a crown you never asked for. He tied you to a war that you did not start." The warrior did not retreat from the heavy weight of her words. He slowly lowered his massive frame, kneeling directly on the rough-hewn floorboards in front of her. The heavy, metallic grinding of his dark obsidian armor echoed loudly in the small, enclosed space. He looked up at her, his storm-grey eyes burning with an intense, unwavering sincerity that pinned her entirely in place. "I did not need an ancient priest to tell me exactly where my loyalties lie," Kalen replied flatly, his voice dropping into a low timbre that vibrated through the wooden floor. "I swore my life and my soul to you the exact moment I watched you stand in the center of that great hall. You were bleeding from a violently severed soul bond, humiliated before thousands, and yet you absolutely refused to give that cowardly king a single tear." He reached out, his rough fingers resting gently on the very edge of the mattress, deliberately stopping inches away from her knee. He was explicitly giving her absolute, uncompromising control over their physical proximity. "You spent your entire life believing the cruel, toxic lies they whispered in the capital," the exiled commander continued, his square jaw tightening with a delayed, fiercely protective fury. "They told you that a girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced because she was never there to begin with. They wanted you invisible, because they were utterly, fundamentally terrified of what would happen if you ever realized your own undeniable worth." Elira's breath hitched sharply in her throat. A hot, unexpected tear slipped silently down her pale cheek, catching the brilliant silver starlight radiating from her own skin. "But I saw you," Kalen murmured, his voice softening into a raw, unguarded confession. "I saw the way you tended to the wounded guards when the royal healers refused to touch the lower ranks. I saw the quiet, unshakable grace you carried every day in a palace built on absolute rot. I have loved you from the shadows for years, but I will never use a prophecy to force a claim on your soul. I will earn you. Every single day of my life, I will earn the absolute right to stand beside you." The profound, staggering weight of his vows completely shattered the final, lingering remnants of the protective ice encasing her heart. She did not complain about her past. She did not beg for reassurance. She simply reached out with a trembling hand, entirely ignoring the mug of tea, and pressed her glowing, starlit palm directly against the rough, scarred stubble of his jawline. He closed his eyes, a heavy, shuddering breath escaping his lungs as he leaned completely into her touch. The fierce, terrifying commander of the Silverpine Vanguard melted entirely under the gentle, grounding caress of the exiled Omega. The cosmic, silver energy of her Vale Walker bloodline pulsed happily beneath her skin, organically weaving a beautiful, invisible thread of pure, unadulterated devotion between their spirits. It was a rare moment of absolute, perfect sanctuary, a quiet triumph of chosen love over political duty. Then, the domestic sanctuary was violently breached. The roaring fire in the stone hearth suddenly sputtered and hissed, the vibrant golden flames inverted, turning a sickly, necrotic shade of bruised purple. The comforting scent of burning cedar was aggressively replaced by the suffocating stench of ozone, rotting earth, and the cloying sweetness of decaying gardenias. Kalen's eyes snapped open. The tender, vulnerable lover vanished in a microscopic fraction of a second, entirely replaced by the ruthless apex predator. He surged to his feet, his massive hand instantly gripping the leather-wrapped hilt of his broadsword. "Stay directly behind me," he commanded, his tone dropping into a lethal, freezing growl that brooked absolutely no argument. They moved swiftly to the heavy timber door. The warrior kicked it open, his dark armor absorbing the ambient moonlight as he stepped out onto the biting, frost-covered porch. Elira followed closely, her bare feet entirely silent on the wood, her silver magic instinctively flaring to life in a blinding defensive preparation. The forest was deathly, unnaturally silent. The nocturnal chatter of the owls, the rustling of the winter hares, the very wind winding through the upper canopy, everything had simply ceased to exist. At the far edge of the clearing, roughly 50 yards from the safety of the cabin, the freezing earth was glowing with a vile, pulsing black luminescence. Embedded deep within the frost-covered moss was an ancient, ominous dark magic relic. It was drastically different from the dormant piece of history the young queen had purified earlier that evening. This was a jagged, manufactured weapon of war. The massive obsidian shard was heavily etched with the glowing, toxic green runes of Lysandra de Vale's northern warlocks. It hummed with a sickening, violent vibration, projecting a dense, freezing wave of necrotic mist that crawled rapidly across the clearing. The foul fog was deliberately seeking to suffocate the radiant, silver light bleeding from the heroine's skin. It was a suppression stone, engineered specifically to drain the physical strength of alpha wolves and completely paralyze the cosmic flow of ancient magic. Before Kaelin could cross the clearing to shatter the foul artifact, the dense, mist-shrouded tree line erupted with sudden, highly coordinated movement. They did not come as a mindless feral pack. They moved with the silent precision of highly trained assassins. 24 royal trackers stepped simultaneously out of the freezing shadows, surrounding the perimeter of the outpost. They wore the midnight blue cloaks of the sovereign kingdom, but their dark armor was desecrated with the same glowing green runes that pulsed on the suppression stone. They were Marcus's elite hunters, heavily reinforced by the forbidden magic of his new bride. The lead tracker stepped forward, a massive, heavily scarred brute wielding a long, serrated silver blade that dripped continuously with a foul, freezing venom. "Commander Sterling," the lead tracker sneered, his voice dripping with arrogant pleasure as it echoed through the dying trees. "The Alpha King sends his regards. You are officially charged with high treason, the theft of royal property, and conspiracy with an exiled Omega. The sentence is immediate execution." The lead tracker's hollow eyes shifted toward Elira. He briefly widened his stance in shock at the blinding silver light radiating from her body, before his expression twisted into a mask of pure disgust. "And the Omega comes back with us in heavy iron chains. The new queen desires a broken pet for the palace dungeons." Kaelin did not bother to negotiate. He did not waste a single precious breath speaking to the corrupted, honorless soldiers of a cowardly king. With a deafening, terrifying roar that physically shook the heavy frost from the canopy above, the ex-exiled commander launched himself directly into the enemy line. The staccato rhythm of absolute chaos consumed the clearing. Metal clashed against metal in a deafening symphony. The warrior was a devastating hurricane of dark obsidian and steel. He moved with blinding speed, his heavy broadsword meeting the magically enchanted armor of the northern trackers with brutal force. He did not fight for glory. He did not fight for a stolen throne. He fought with the completely unrestrained desperation of a man, protecting his absolute soulmate. Tracker after tracker fell back beneath his blade, unable to match his physical dominance despite the foul mist rolling off the suppression stone. But the relic was rapidly doing its intended work. The violent, pulsing green energy radiating from the stone drastically altered the atmospheric pressure. A suffocating gravity pressed down heavily on the clearing. The silver stardust beneath Elira's skin flared in fierce, burning resistance, fighting the encroaching necrotic frosts with a searing, desperate heat. Elira gasped, her knees buckling as the toxic magic fought to choke the brilliant silver light, desperately trying to flow through her veins. The somatic toll on the lethal enforcer was immediate and catastrophic. His movements, usually flawlessly fluid and terrifyingly precise, began to drag. The freezing, necrotic aura of the relic seeped directly into his lungs, turning his rapid, exertion-heavy breaths into thick white plumes of icy frost. His massive muscles, strained to their absolute limit by the sheer, crushing weight of the dark magic, began to visibly lock. The lead tracker immediately saw the physical hesitation. He was a ruthless coward, thoroughly trained in the opportunistic, underhanded tactics of the Northern Warlocks. Instead of engaging the towering commander in honorable, face-to-face combat, the tracker sharply signaled his 3 remaining flankers. They completely ignored the struggling warrior. They lunged simultaneously toward the wooden porch, their poisoned silver blades aimed directly at the glowing queen's chest. "No!" Kaelan roared, the sound ripping violently from his throat with an agonizing, primal terror. He completely abandoned his defensive stance. He ignored the 3 armed trackers aggressively closing in on his unprotected back. Driven by an absolute overriding instinct that totally eclipsed logic, self-preservation, and sanity, Kaelan threw his massive, armored body directly across the clearing, desperately intercepting the lethal strike meant for his mate. A sudden, heavy impact echoed across the frozen earth, bringing the entire world to a horrific, grinding halt. The lead tracker's cursed, serrated silver blade found its mark, striking deep where his dark armor offered no protection. The weapon was quenched in the freezing, toxic magic of Northern Warlocks, specifically designed to paralyze a shifter's natural healing factor. The devastation of the foul magic was instantaneous. The freezing venom pulsed rapidly into his system. He gasped, a sharp inhalation of pure agony, as the cursed frost mercilessly seized his strength. The dark magic rushed through him, turning his heavy breaths into thick plumes of icy frost. His massive hands gripped the lead tracker's forearms in a desperate attempt to dislodge the weapon, but the dark magic was already ruthlessly devouring his remaining strength. His knees finally buckled under the immense, catastrophic shock to his nervous system. The invincible, terrifying commander of the vanguard collapsed heavily into the freezing snow. Elira screamed, her voice violently shattering the night, a sound of such profound apocalyptic heartbreak that it seemed to physically crack the very sky. The lead tracker stepped back with a cold laugh as the warrior fell completely motionless at his feet. The dark magic of the suppression stone hummed with a triumphant, sickening vibration, while the only man who had ever truly loved her lay motionless on the frozen earth. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed Kaelan. Sterling's collapse was a physical weight, pressing down upon the blood-stained snow of the Shadowwood clearing. Elira Vance's apocalyptic scream had violently shattered the quiet night, but now the only sound left was the sickening, wet rasp of the exiled commander fighting for a single breath. The cursed, serrated silver blade remained lodged deep in his chest, exactly where the heavy obsidian armor had failed to protect him. The freezing, necrotic venom of the Northern Warlocks was working with terrifying, predatory efficiency. Dark, jagged veins of toxic green frost spiderwebbed rapidly across his pale neck, forcefully locking his massive muscles and ruthlessly suffocating the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. The lead tracker let out a harsh, guttural bark of cruel laughter. His heavy, iron-shod boots crunched loudly against the frost-covered earth as he stepped back to admire his treacherous work. The air around him was incredibly thick, heavily polluted with the suffocating stench of decaying gardenias, rotting wood, and the bitter metallic tang of ozone pouring from the active suppression stone. "Look at the mighty invincible vanguard," the northern assassin mocked, spitting a thick wad of phlegm onto the pristine white snow mere inches from the warrior's motionless face. The most lethal enforcer in the Northern Kingdom, reduced to a shivering, pathetic corpse for the sake of a broken, wolfless Omega. What a magnificent waste of good steel. The assassin casually wiped his armored gauntlet against his heavy midnight blue cloak, entirely dismissing the fallen commander as a neutralized threat. He turned his hollow, merciless eyes toward the wooden porch of the cabin, signaling the remaining flankers with a sharp flick of his wrist. Bind the girl. Use the heavy iron chains and secure her wrists tightly. The new queen was explicitly clear that she wants this defective little rat dragged back to the capital dungeons alive, so she can listen to her scream when the Alpha King finally figures out how to break her spirit for good. The tracker never finished his cruel, arrogant command. Elira did not cower against the timber walls of the cabin. She did not drop to her knees and beg the ruthless mercenaries for mercy. She did not dissolve into a puddle of useless, paralyzed panic. The terrified, defensive Omega, who had kept her head bowed in the capital palace, had died the exact moment Marcus Valerius severed their soul bond on the royal altar. The young woman standing on the frost-covered porch was something entirely different. She was a survivor who had finally found a genuine, unconditional sanctuary, and she absolutely refused to let these honorless cowards steal it from her. Her grey eyes locked onto the massive, jagged obsidian relic embedded in the center of the clearing. The suppression stone was the absolute core of the assassin's strength, continuously pumping a dense, freezing wave of necrotic gravity into the atmosphere. It was deliberately engineered to paralyze alpha physiology and choke out ancient magic, pulsing with the sickening green runes of Lysandra Devaya's wealthy, toxic dynasty. Elira knew exactly what she had to do. If the foul artifact remained active, the toxic frost would completely consume Kalen's internal organs within minutes, stopping his heart forever. She sprinted off the wooden porch, her bare feet hitting the freezing, blood-spattered mud with reckless, desperate speed. The remaining trackers shouted in sudden alarm, raising their poisoned weapons, but they were entirely too slow to intercept her frantic, determined dash. She completely ignored the heavily armed men. She ignored the biting, merciless winter wind whipping her dark hair across her pale face. She ignored the suffocating, crushing pressure of the necrotic mist, trying to force her down into the dirt. She threw her fragile body directly at the source of the lethal curse. Her knees slammed brutally into the frozen earth, directly in front of the pulsing artifact. Without a single microsecond of hesitation or fear for her own life, Elira reached out and slammed both of her bare, dirt-smudged hands directly onto the jagged, freezing surface of the dark magic relic. The lead tracker let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter, fully expecting the toxic obsidian to instantly rot the foolish girl's flesh straight down to the bone. The suppression stone was fundamentally designed to violently consume any living entity that dared to touch its surface. But Elira Vance was not just any living entity. The exact moment her palms made physical contact with the cursed runes, the world did not end in agonizing, necrotic decay. Instead, a violently sudden, breathtaking shockwave of pure, unadulterated cosmic resonance ripped through the quiet forest. It was an explosion of supreme, ancient energy that completely defied the laws of the physical world. The dark artifact attempted to drain her, violently pulling at the core of her spirit. But instead of finding the shallow, easily depleted well of a normal shifter, the relic hit the infinite, bottomless ocean of the Veil Walker bloodline. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the dormant divine magic rushing out to meet the curse was catastrophic to the stone's internal structure. She gasped, her head throwing back as a blinding, brilliant sensation of liquid moonlight rushed violently through her veins. The cosmic energy had been quietly whispering beneath her skin for weeks, slowly healing the deep, jagged psychological wounds left by her past humiliation. Now, triggered by the absolute desperate need to protect her true chosen guardian. The magic stopped whispering and began to roar. A high, piercing frequency of absolute truth vibrated in her very marrow, immediately shattering the toxic green runes etched into the obsidian shard. The heavy, suffocating gravity pressing down on the clearing was instantly obliterated, violently replaced by a sensation of supreme, weightless levitation. The intricate, geometric patterns of silver stardust beneath her pale skin flared with the intensity of a dying sun. The celestial markings rapidly expanded past her wrists, weaving up her arms and wrapping her entire body in a blinding, ethereal luminescence. The massive suppression stone could not contain the divine resonance. With a deafening, glass-shattering crack that physically knocked the closest trackers off their feet, the dark magic relic exploded. It did not merely break into jagged pieces, it was fundamentally, molecularly purified. The obsidian dissolved into a brilliant, glowing cascade of silver ash, the foul green mist instantly vaporized by a rapidly expanding dome of radiant lunar light. The suffocating stench of rotting gardenias was completely wiped from existence, instantly replaced by the incredibly crisp, clean scent of winter pine, pure mountain snow, and the electric, crackling ozone of ancient starlight. The brutal, highly coordinated ambush dissolved into absolute, chaotic panic. The blinding silver light, radiating from the young woman's small frame, illuminated the darkest corners of the shadowwood canopy, casting long, terrified shadows from the royal trackers who had dared to invade her sanctuary. Elira slowly rose to her feet, the crushed, purified silver ash of the suppression stone drifting harmlessly around her ankles like newly fallen snow. She did not look like a broken, exiled Omega. She looked exactly like the ancient, terrifying wrath of the moon goddess herself, fully descended upon the mortal plane to balance the scales of justice. Her eyes, normally a quiet, observant grey, were now glowing with a solid, unyielding liquid silver. The lead tracker stumbled backward, his heavy boots slipping desperately in the freezing mud. The sheer, physical magnitude of the cosmic aura pressing against him was incomprehensible. It was not the aggressive, domineering gravity of a typical Alpha's command, which demanded submission through sheer terror. It was an absolute, sovereign resonance that demanded total, uncompromising reverence from the very earth itself. Kill her. The assassin shrieked, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, frantic desperation as he realized his immense tactical advantage was completely gone. Strike her down now before she burns us all. 3 of the bravest, or perhaps most foolish, flankers lunged forward. They raised their enchanted, serrated blades, aiming directly for the glowing queen's heart. Elira did not flinch. She did not draw a weapon, nor did she retreat a single inch. She simply raised her starlight-infused right hand, her expression completely serene, utterly devoid of the chaotic, desperate panic that had previously defined her life in the capital. We are small things in a world of teeth, they had once told her in the lower boundary villages. But they had completely misunderstood the fundamental nature of power. Smallness was not weakness, it was the quiet, invisible seed of an absolute, world-ending sovereignty. As the tracker's blades descended, she gently pushed her glowing palm outward. A massive, rippling shockwave of pure, liquid silver fire erupted from her hand. It moved with blinding, impossible speed, sweeping across the clearing like a tidal wave of cosmic light. The moment the silver resonance made contact with the assassins, the results were instantaneous and utterly devastating. The dark, enchanted metals of their armor hissed violently. The toxic, poisoned steel of their drawn weapons literally turned to ash mid-air, dissolving into fine grey dust before the blades could even graze her skin. The 3 flankers collapsed to the frozen earth, screaming in sheer terror as the divine magic ruthlessly stripped the corrupt, borrowed strength from their veins. They were not physically burned, but the magical suppression completely neutralized their combat abilities, leaving them as weak and helpless as newborn pups. The lead tracker, witnessing the absolute, effortless destruction of his elite unit, dropped his remaining weapon. His arrogance evaporated, entirely replaced by a raw, primal horror. He fell heavily to his knees, pressing his forehead directly into the freezing mud, his body trembling violently under the sheer, oppressive weight of her sovereign aura. The rest of the surviving vanguard immediately followed his lead, dropping their swords and groveling in the snow, fundamentally incapable of standing against the true, awakened vessel of the ancient law. The Veil Walker did not spare the kneeling, broken assassins a single lingering glance. Their punishment would be determined later, when the capital was finally cleansed of its toxic rot. Right now, there was only one thing in the entire fractured realm that mattered to her. She turned her back on the groveling trackers and rushed to where Kalen lay completely motionless on the blood-stained earth. The massive, lethal commander was fading rapidly. The cursed silver blade had been completely purified when the suppression stone exploded, but the physical damage to his chest was catastrophic. His breathing was a shallow, ragged, and entirely inconsistent rattle. His incredibly broad shoulders, which had so willingly borne the immense weight of her safety, were completely still. His storm-grey eyes were half-closed, the fierce, protective winter storm within them rapidly dimming into a hollow, empty void. "No, no, no," Elira whispered, her voice cracking with a raw, desperate agony as she fell to her knees beside his massive frame. She ignored the freezing snow soaking through her linen dress. She ignored the terrified whimpers of the royal assassins behind her. She reached out with trembling, glowing hands, hovering them directly over the deep, jagged wound in his dark obsidian breastplate. "Elira," Kalen breathed, his deep voice barely a harsh, raspy whisper. He forced his heavily calloused hand to lift from the snow, his scarred fingers blindly seeking the warmth of her cheek. He was dying, his internal organs shutting down from the massive physical trauma, but his only concern was comforting her. "You are safe. You are beautiful." "Do not speak," she commanded, tears of pure, blinding silver starlight finally spilling over her lashes and dropping onto his dark armor. "You promised me that you would stand beside me. You promised to earn me every single day. You do not get to break that vow, Kalen Sterling. I absolutely forbid it." She pressed both of her glowing, silver-traced palms directly against the freezing, shattered edges of his breastplate. She did not possess the clinical, academic knowledge of the royal healers. She did not know the complex structural anatomy of a shifter's cardiovascular system, but she did not need to. Her Veil Walker bloodline was not a system of rigid, logical rules. It was an intuitive, ancient magic driven entirely by the profound, limitless capacity for emotional connection. She closed her eyes, violently forcing every single ounce of her awakened, cosmic resonance out of her own spirit and directly into his dying body. They had called him a terrifying beast in the capital, a ruthless killer devoid of a soul, but she knew the absolute truth. Because monsters do not sacrifice their own lives for broken outcasts, because monsters do not shield defenseless omegas with their own bodies, because monsters do not look at her the way he did. The somatic connection was immediate and incredibly intense. Elira physically felt the terrifying, icy void of his failing heart beneath her palms. The lingering tendrils of the warlock's necrotic venom fought viciously against her intrusion, attempting to freeze the silver starlight flowing from her skin. But the young queen absolutely refused to yield. She pushed harder, her own heartbeat accelerating to a frantic, thunderous rhythm, deliberately acting as a surrogate pulse to kickstart his own. The silver light pouring from her hands intensified, turning into a blinding, liquid cascade that rapidly seeped through the shattered armor and directly into the warrior's ruined chest. The divine magic systematically hunted down the toxic green frost inside his veins, incinerating the corruption with a searing, pure heat. Kalen's massive body arched violently off the frozen ground, a sharp, ragged gasp ripping from his throat as the cosmic energy flooded his nervous system. She leaned closer, pressing her forehead directly against his, her tears mixing with the silver light illuminating their faces. She wove her magic into his torn muscles, meticulously stitching the ruptured tissue back together with microscopic threads of pure, solidified starlight. The deep, agonizing cold that had paralyzed his lungs was rapidly chased away by a profound, overwhelming warmth, exactly like the gentle, persistent rays of the sun breaking through a bitter winter storm. But the healing did not stop at mere physical repair. As the fatal wound finally closed, leaving behind a smooth, flawless expanse of healthy skin beneath the broken metal, the blinding silver light radiating between them suddenly shifted. The ethereal, lunar glow slowly warmed, seamlessly transitioning into a brilliant, vibrant, molten gold. Elira gasped, pulling her head back just enough to look down at his chest. Emerging directly from the center of Kaelin's heart was a single, glowing golden thread. It was entirely unlike the chaotic, burning, forced alpha-claiming mark that Marcus had once violently branded onto her wrist. This was a physical manifestation of a true divine fated mate bond, a somatic, soul-deep connection built entirely on absolute trust, mutual sacrifice, and unconditional safety. The golden thread floated upward, pulsing in perfect, flawless synchronicity with their matching heartbeats. It drifted toward Elira's chest, sinking effortlessly through her linen dress and directly into her ribcage. The exact moment the ethereal tether anchored itself to her soul, a wave of profound, indescribable euphoria washed over her entire being. The lingering, hollow phantom ache of her past betrayal was completely, permanently erased, entirely overwritten by the steady, unshakable certainty of her commander's absolute devotion. He belonged to her, and she belonged to him, not by the cruel political dictates of a cowardly king, but by the undeniable, supreme choice of their own sovereign souls. Kaelin took a deep, completely unhindered breath, his massive chest expanding as his lungs filled with the crisp, clean air of the purified forest. His storm-grey eyes snapped fully open, the fierce, protective fire within them restored to its absolute, unyielding glory. He looked up at the radiant, glowing woman leaning over him, feeling the steady, warm hum of the golden bond anchoring his spirit to hers. He did not question the impossible miracle. He did not hesitate. The exiled warrior reached up with his strong, battle-scarred hands, gently pulling her down against his newly healed chest. He buried his face into the crook of her neck, his massive frame trembling slightly as he breathed in the scent of ozone and starlight that now defined his true, chosen queen. The silent outcast had not just survived the darkness, she had entirely consumed it, and the kingdom would never, ever be the same. The oppressive winter had not lifted from the capital, despite the passing of 5 grueling months. Inside the cavernous palace hall of the sovereign lands, the atmosphere was incredibly suffocating, heavily saturated with the scent of burning beeswax, stale wine, and the underlying sour musk of deep political paranoia. Marcus Valerius sat rigidly upon the massive obsidian throne, his broad shoulders tense beneath his heavy midnight blue furs. The golden charisma that had once easily charmed the entire court was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, calculating cruelty. The Northern Alliance he had so ruthlessly secured by claiming Lysandra de Valor had proven to be an absolute, unmitigated disaster. The wealthy Duchess sat beside him, draped in her signature crimson silk, her cloying gardenia perfume doing absolutely nothing to mask the stench of the kingdom's slow, agonizing decay. Her warlocks had failed to return from the Shadowwood. The elite trackers had simply vanished into the mist. A creeping, paralyzing dread had settled over the royal council, whispering that the ancient laws were finally demanding their bloody payment. Marcus rubbed his temples, a sharp, persistent ache throbbing directly behind his amber eyes. He was the Alpha King, the undisputed ruler of the fractured werewolf realms, yet he felt profoundly, fundamentally empty. The severing of his fated bond on this very altar had left a jagged, hollow void in his chest that absolutely no amount of political power or northern silver could ever fill. He had confidently believed that discarding a weak, low-status Omega would solidify his absolute dominance. He was entirely wrong, because the true sovereign had finally discovered her worth, and she was coming for what was hers. The heavy, suffocating silence of the Royal Assembly was violently shattered by a sudden, deafening boom. The massive, iron-bound oak doors at the far end of the vast chamber did not merely open. They were physically blasted inward by a terrifying, concussive wave of pure atmospheric pressure. The heavy metal hinges shrieked, tearing completely free from the ancient granite walls. Hundreds of elite wolves and high-born nobles gasped in unison, scrambling backward in absolute chaotic panic as a glacial, violent gale swept through the room, instantly extinguishing every single candle in the massive wrought-iron chandeliers. The room plunged into deep, oppressive darkness for a fraction of a heartbeat, and then the shadows were ruthlessly eradicated by a blinding, brilliant cascade of liquid moonlight. Stepping through the shattered threshold of the palace was not the broken, silent outcast who had been so cruelly banished 5 months ago. Elira Vance moved with the slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying grace of a descending goddess. She was draped in a simple, flowing gown of pale silver silk, entirely devoid of the heavy, ostentatious jewels favored by the capital elite. She did not need them. Her pale skin radiated a profound ethereal luminescence, intricately woven with glowing geometric patterns of celestial stardust that pulsed with every single beat of her heart. Her eyes, once a quiet, submissive grey, were now burning pools of solid, unyielding liquid silver. Walking precisely 1/2 step behind her, his massive presence providing an impenetrable wall of lethal protection, was Cailan Sterling. The exiled commander had returned. He did not wear the ceremonial, decorative armor of the Royal Vanguard. He was clad in the battle-scarred obsidian plating of his Shadowwood sanctuary, his heavy broadsword resting casually on his broad hip. The fierce, protective winter storm raging in his dark eyes was absolute. But what truly stole the breath from the panicked court was the undeniable, physical manifestation of the divine magic connecting the two warriors. A brilliant, glowing golden mate thread pulsed visibly between their chests, a somatic, soul-deep tether of pure, unadulterated devotion that hummed with a resonance so powerful it made the ancient floorboards vibrate. Leading the procession was priest Thomas Oakhaven, the ancient keeper of the old law. He struck his carved ash staff against the granite floor, the rhythmic, booming sound cutting through the terrified whispers of the nobility. Following closely behind the priest were dozens of scattered loyalists, old elders, and boundary village leaders who had spent decades waiting for the ancient prophecies to awaken. Treason! Lysandra de Val shrieked, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, frantic desperation as she shot to her feet, her crimson silk pooling around her ankles. Guards, arrest them immediately. Kill the exiled traitors. Not a single soldier in the vast hall moved a muscle. The royal guards, the very men Cailan had personally trained, stared in absolute, paralyzing awe at the glowing queen and the lethal commander. The sheer, oppressive weight of the Veil Walker's sovereign aura pressed down upon the room, not with the aggressive, terrifying gravity of an Alpha's command, but with a profound, undeniable resonance that demanded total reverence from the earth itself. The frost on the stones literally melted beneath her bare feet, transforming into small, blooming patches of glowing silver moss. Marcus surged to his feet, his massive hands gripping the carved armrests of his obsidian throne, so tightly the dark stone cracked. The jagged, empty void in his chest violently convulsed as he stared at the radiant, breathtaking woman he had so foolishly thrown away. She was not a weak Omega. She was a supreme, cosmic force of nature. Elira, the deposed sovereign, snarled, desperately attempting to project his dominant aura across the vast space. He forced a thick, suffocating wave of alpha command toward her, a heavy, oppressive energy designed to force any lesser wolf straight to their knees. It was a tangible, crushing gravity, a dark manifestation of stolen authority that rippled aggressively across the polished floorboards, intent on crushing her independence. The dark, heavy wave of his alpha command rushed across the room, but the exact moment it touched the invisible silver boundary of her ancient magic, it completely shattered. The coercive energy dissolved into harmless grey smoke, instantly vaporized by the sheer, searing purity of her divine bloodline. She did not even blink. She did not flinch. She simply continued her slow, deliberate walk up the central aisle, the steadfast presence of her chosen mate anchoring her every step. "You are no king, Marcus," Elira spoke. Her voice was not loud, yet it possessed a high, piercing frequency of absolute truth that vibrated in the very marrow of every single wolf in the room. "You are a coward hiding behind stolen titles and poisoned alliances. You severed a sacred bond for a handful of silver, completely blinding yourself to the fundamental nature of true power." Thomas Oakhaven stepped to the side, raising his weathered hands toward the vaulted ceiling. "The ancient law has awakened," the priest's voice boomed, echoing with centuries of suppressed history. "The Veil Walker bloodline, the original, divine heirs of the moon goddess, has returned to cleanse the rot from the Silverpine Kingdom. We call upon the ancestral spirits to recognize the true vessel and balance the scales of justice." The atmosphere inside the great hall underwent a catastrophic, terrifying shift. The ambient temperature plummeted violently, a bitter, otherworldly frost rapidly climbing the high granite walls. The massive, woven tapestries depicting the violent history of past alphas began to ripple and tear as if invisible, colossal hands were ruthlessly shredding the false legacy. A blinding, ethereal light erupted from the grand stone altar at the base of the dais, the spectral, glowing forms of the ancient ancestors, massive, translucent wolves of pure lunar energy, materialized from the very foundation of the palace. They did not bow to the man sitting on the obsidian throne. They turned their massive, glowing heads entirely toward the young woman in the silver silk, lowering their muzzles to the floor in a gesture of absolute, unshakable submission. Marcus stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold stone of his throne. A raw, primal horror finally eclipsed his arrogance. "No," he gasped, frantically clutching his chest as the massive spectral wolves began to ascend the dais. "I am the chosen alpha. I hold the divine right." The ancestral spirits ignored his frantic pleas. They surged forward, passing directly through the physical bodies of the terrified royal guards, and lunged at the false king. They did not bite his flesh. They sank their ethereal, glowing fangs directly into his spirit. Marcus let out a horrifying, agonizing scream that violently shattered the remaining stained glass windows in the high vaulted ceilings. The immense, golden aura of his alpha authority, the supreme, commanding magic that had allowed him to dominate the fractured werewolf realms, was violently, ruthlessly ripped from his soul. Elira watched with completely serene, detached observation as the heavy, oppressive power was forcibly extracted from his chest. The spiritual severing was absolute. His amber eyes, once burning with the fierce fire of leadership, instantly dimmed into a hollow, pathetic, muddy brown. His massive muscles seemed to visibly shrink, the terrifying physical stature of the apex predator instantly collapsing into the fragile, shivering frame of an ordinary, powerless man. Lysandra de Val screamed in sheer terror, desperately scrambling away from the broken man on the throne. The wealthy Duchess realized with sickening clarity that her grand political alliance was completely, entirely dead. The arrogant Alpha King had been systematically stripped of every single ounce of his divine magic. He was nothing but an empty, shattered husk, entirely devoid of the right to rule. The cavernous hall of the Silverpine Kingdom was entirely paralyzed, completely gripped by the overwhelming magnitude of the cosmic judgment they had just witnessed. Marcus lay collapsed on the polished granite floor at the base of the dais, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow, and pathetic gasps. The suffocating golden aura of his alpha authority was gone, leaving behind a sickening, hollow vacuum. Illyra did not rush forward to mock him. She did not raise her voice in a chaotic, vindictive triumph. She simply stood at the very center of the room, her silver starlight illuminating the terrified faces of the elite nobility who had once delighted in her humiliation. The ethereal tether connecting her heart to Kaelin's pulsed with a steady, profound warmth, completely insulating her from the toxic, desperate fear rolling off the deposed sovereign. The deep somatic resonance of their unbroken, chosen bond was a living, breathing testament to the absolute power of unconditional trust. She slowly ascended the wide stone steps of the dais, her bare feet silent against the frost-locked granite. Kaelin followed closely, his heavy boots ringing out with a slow, deliberate, and terrifying finality. He did not view the broken man on the floor with anger. He looked at him with a profound, heavy disgust, viewing the former king as nothing more than a pathetic, insignificant insect that had completely destroyed its own life. Marcus forced his head up, his muddy brown eyes locking onto the radiant, breathtaking woman standing above him. A massive, crushing wave of absolute, agonizing regret finally slammed into his chest, violently shattering the last fragile remnants of his delusional pride. He saw the intricate, glowing stardust patterns weaving across her pale skin. He felt the immense, sovereign purity radiating from her soul, and then his hollow gaze shifted to the brilliant golden mate thread, anchoring her spirit directly to his former commander. The visceral, physical pain of his colossal mistake was unbearable. He had held the true divine vessel of the moon goddess in his arms. He had possessed her absolute, unshakable devotion. He could have ruled the entire world with her gentle, guiding light beside him. Instead, he had brutally cast her into the bitter winter night for a handful of useless northern swords, completely blinding himself to the supreme treasure he had held. "Illyra," the broken man wheezed, his voice cracking into a high, desperate sob. He dragged his heavy, weakened body across the stone floor, his trembling fingers reaching out to desperately grasp the hem of her silver gown. "Illyra, please. I was blind. I was poisoned by the Council's lies. I am your true fated mate, the ancestors. They made a mistake. Please, I beg you, heal my soul. Give me back my crown. I will do anything. I will grovel at your feet for a century. Just please do not leave me in this agonizing void." The entire court watched in stunned, breathless silence as the once terrifying Alpha King literally wept on his knees, his face pressed directly into the biting cold dirt at the outcast Omega's feet. It was the ultimate, poetic retribution, a sudden status reversal so absolute and devastating that it completely rewrote the fundamental hierarchy of the pack. Illyra looked down at the weeping, shattered man. The hollow, ashen scar of the dead crescent claiming mark on her left wrist had long since been overwritten by her divine magic, but she perfectly remembered the exact, agonizing sensation of the frost-cold blade he had metaphorically twisted into her heart on this very altar. She felt absolutely no pity. She felt no lingering affection. The man kneeling in the dirt was a complete, irrelevant stranger. She gently, deliberately stepped back, completely pulling the silver silk from his desperate, grasping fingers. A bond built on political convenience and cowardly ambition is not a fated bond, Marcus, Illyra spoke, her voice echoing with a cool, detached sovereignty that finalized his absolute ruin. You did not reject a defective Omega on that altar. You entirely rejected your own salvation. I survived your cruelty because I found a true guardian who values my soul more than a throne. You will live the rest of your miserable, powerless life fully aware of exactly what you threw away. Marcus let out a raw, guttural wail of sheer, unadulterated despair, completely collapsing onto the floor as the absolute finality of her rejection crushed his spirit. Illyra turned her back on the deposed king, completely dismissing him from her reality, and faced the vast assembly of the Silverpine court. The terrified nobles immediately dropped to their knees, bowing their heads in profound, unquestioning submission to the true Vale Walker sovereign. Even Lysandra, trembling violently in her crimson silk, fell to the floor, desperately hoping to avoid the wrath of the glowing queen. Priest Thomas approached the center of the dais, carrying a small ancient obsidian lockbox. He opened the heavy lid, and a brilliant, blinding light spilled into the room. Resting on a bed of dark velvet was the lunar crown, a divine, ethereal artifact woven entirely from solidified starlight, ancient silver, and the pure, concentrated resonance of the moon goddess. It was a crown that had not been seen in the mortal realm for 1,000 years, waiting silently in the deep vaults for the true bloodline to awaken. Thomas lifted the glowing artifact, his weathered hands trembling with absolute reverence, and gently placed it upon the young queen's dark hair. The exact moment the silver metal touched her skin, a massive, concussive wave of pure, restorative magic erupted from her body. The heavy, oppressive winter chill that had choked the capital for months was instantly obliterated. The shattered stained glass windows were organically repaired by weaving vines of glowing silver light. The foul, stagnant air of the palace was immediately purified, replaced by the crisp, breathtaking scent of blooming spring flowers and clean mountain rain. The somatic resonance of her supreme power washed over the entire pack, completely healing the deep, systemic rot that had plagued the kingdom under the previous cruel reign. But the young queen was not finished. She turned to Cailan Sterling, the massive, battle-scarred warrior who had sacrificed his rank, his lands, and his very life to shield her from the darkness. He stood quietly beside the throne, perfectly content to remain entirely in her shadow, asking for absolutely nothing in return for his absolute devotion. But she fundamentally refused to rule without him. She reached out, her glowing, starlight-infused hands gently grasping the heavy iron gauntlets of his dark armor. She pulled the towering commander to the absolute center of the dais, directly in front of the grand altar. "You promised me that you would stand beside me," Elira murmured softly, her words meant for his ears but carrying clearly across the silent hall. "You promised to earn me every single day, and you have given me a sanctuary when the entire world offered only teeth. You are not a shadow, Cailan. You are the immovable mountain that protected the stars." She reached up and unclasped the heavy, ceremonial dark royal mantle that the ex-mate had discarded in his panic. But instead of placing the corrupted fur on Cailan's broad shoulders, she summoned the pure, liquid silver fire of her Vale Walker bloodline. She wove the cosmic energy into a brilliant sovereign mantle of starlight and shadow, a supreme divine garment that represented the ultimate fusion of their souls. She draped it carefully over his massive shoulders, the ethereal fabric instantly molding to his dark obsidian armor. "Before the ancestors, the elders, and the true laws of this realm," Elira announced, her sovereign voice ringing out with an absolute, undeniable authority that demanded total allegiance, "I formally claim Cailan Sterling as my chosen mate, my equal partner, and my sovereign consort. He is the true king of the Silverpine realm, not by political theft, but by the undeniable supreme choice of the lunar crown." Cailan's storm-grey eyes widened, a profound, heavy emotion threatening to break his stoic facade. He did not care about the title. He did not care about the vast, sprawling kingdom or the thousands of wolves now bowing deeply in absolute, terrified reverence before him. He only cared about the small, radiant woman standing before him, the exiled outcast who had fundamentally rewritten his entire universe. The massive, terrifying commander of the vanguard slowly, deliberately sank to one knee on the polished granite floor. He bowed his dark head, completely submitting his lethal, world-ending strength to her gentle, glowing hands. He pressed his lips fiercely to her knuckles, the golden mate thread between their chests pulsing with a blinding, euphoric heat that entirely consumed the lingering shadows of their past. My life, my blade, and my soul are yours, Kaelin swore, his deep, resonant voice trembling with a raw, unguarded devotion. From this day until the end of the world, I am yours, Elira. She smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression of pure, unadulterated joy that illuminated the darkest corners of the ancient palace. She gently pulled him back to his feet, her small fingers wrapping securely around his massive, calloused hand. They turned together, standing shoulder to shoulder, entirely equal, as they faced their newly reclaimed kingdom. In the lower boundary villages, the outcast Omegas and forgotten laborers looked up at the sky as the dark, oppressive winter clouds finally broke, revealing a brilliant, silver moon that outshone the midday sun. In the royal hall, the corrupt nobility wept in terror and awe, realizing that the era of political cruelty was permanently, irrevocably dead, and on the cold granite floor, stripped of his magic, his wealth, and his dignity, Marcus lay sobbing in the dirt, completely paralyzed by the agonizing, eternal knowledge that he had personally forged the very weapon of his own destruction. With the keep mended, the toxic court dismantled, and the true bloodline restored, Elira and Kaelin prepared to rebuild the fractured world. The thawing of the Silverpine Kingdom would be recounted by the elders for generations to come. It was not brought about by the warmth of the spring sun. Instead, the true spring was ushered in by a quiet, resilient queen, who survived the bitter frost and the fierce, devoted beast who chose to stand beside her in the dark.